Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us in our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. My name is Ardian Berisha, and I'm the Portfolio Marketing Manager for Information Security and Management at PCB. Today we will be discussing artificial intelligence to pass to ISO compliance. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter for today, Mr. John McClurg, who serves as a Vice President and Ambassador at Large at Cylance, and is also responsible for building security and trust programs. He also served at FBI as an FBI supervisory special agent, and also he served as an on-assignment deputy branch chief with the CIA, helping to establish the new Counterespionage Group. Please be reminded that you will have the opportunity to submit written questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the question pane of the control panel. I hope you will have the chance to learn new valuable things in today's session. Please, John, you may start with your presentation.
Thank you, Ardian. I appreciate it very much. It's good to be with all of you. May you live in interesting times. As a young boy, I hated being bored more than about anything, so I always thought of that as a benediction. It wasn't until recently that some colleagues of mine pointed out that Robert Kennedy, in a speech shortly before his death given in South Africa, actually characterized that phrase as an old Chinese curse. Well, whether we think of it as a blessing or a curse, one of the things that truly makes these interesting times is the pace and rate at which technology is advancing and changing. And at the heart of that, of course, lies cyber. In Tom Friedman, and it's amazing that it's already been 10 years since Tom Friedman wrote his iconic work, The World is Flat. I've always liked that book, in part because it had a chapter in there that called out the innovative things that we were doing at Dell in the area of supply chain. But I also liked the book because of the way in which he was one of the first to opine that what would characterize our times more than anything else was the fact that traditional boundaries of interest would go ever more porous, whether that was the distinctions we normally drew between cyber and physical, domestic and international, public and private, church and state, business and security. They were all growing ever more porous, and the rollout of the Internet of Things even enhanced or increased the rate at which that porosity was occurring, whether we're talking about our household appliances, driverless cars, cameras, human organs, and even SCADA systems. They're all connected now, of course, to that internet. And many of you, of course, know or appreciate that supervisory control and data acquisition systems are those industry computers that monitors and controls the critical processes that make up so many of the critical services that we receive in our situations. And of course, with that increase in connectivity or porosity, of course, comes an increase in the number of threat vectors or avenues open to an adversary. So that's happening at the same time and requiring that we rethink the way in which we've grappled with or managed those increasing threats. In fact, it's not unlike the poem that the American poet Robert Frost wrote when he spoke of two roads that diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less traveled, and that's made all the difference. For us in the world of security, who are often looking to ISO certification or NIST certification, we're faced with a similar challenge in that we now have two paths that are diverging. One of the classic, usually taken road of reactive detection, and the new paradigm, the new road that's opened up to us now of proactive prevention. And it's about that second path that I'd like to spend some time discussing and exploring with everyone this morning. My introduction, or the reactive detection versus the proactive prevention, I think the security profession has long aspired or wished we could be proactively preventative, but found ourselves stymied in the world of reactive detection. We wanted to be the proverbial guardrail at the top of the cliff, but so often found ourselves as the proverbial ambulance at the bottom. My personal introduction into the world of the reactive occurred shortly after law school. I had decided I would go on to academia and was pursuing a PhD in a critical field of study upon which I say the stability of the universe teeters at any moment. Hermeneutics. If I were looking at you in your face, I'd probably see these glaring or glossy eyes. Very few people have ever heard of hermeneutics. It's a hodgepodge of psychology, sociology, anthropology, philosophy, with a little bit of linguistics mixed in. It's an examination or study of the variables around which human beings construct and impute meaning, interpret their world around them. That's what I was going to teach at the university, and I probably would have, except for the fact that the FBI got it into their head that they needed a hermeneuticist in the new Joint Terrorism Task Force that they were pulling together. I was pretty sure they didn't, but at the end of the day, they won out in that discussion. They put me through 4 months of training at the FBI Training Academy at Quantico, handed me a weapon, that's a scary thought, and a badge, and sent me off to Los Angeles, where I joined the Joint Terrorism Task Force, where we as a team had very much desired to be proactive in our prevention of terrorism, but so often found ourselves in a reactive mode, whether it was the Lockerbie bombing over Scotland, which we worked out of Los Angeles, the Oklahoma City bombing, or even the Unabomber. I was one of those many who chased him unsuccessfully. In all of our desires, we found ourselves in the reactive mode. And the same was true when the FBI started to branch out into things cyber. I was one of the first to work a cyber matter that arose in the FBI. It was a matter involving a young man by the name of Dante. His real name was Kevin Poulsen. He's now actually an editor at Wired magazine. But I remember the boss coming in one day shouting out to the task force, you know, who here knows anything about Unix? Well, I grew up in Libya before the Six-Day War. I lived among the Arab boys, and they often talked about the 6,000 Libyan warriors who once went up against Pharaoh in battle. Those they lost, those that were not killed were castrated and sent home as eunuchs. So when the boss said, who knows anything about Unix, I looked around the task force and I thought, you know, as a hermeneuticist, I want to add value. I'm sure I know as much about Unix as anybody else. I raised my hand. He plopped the file down and said, don't screw this up, McClurg. National security is at risk. And I started looking for the eunuch. I couldn't find him anywhere. I saw a whole bunch about UNIX, the operating system of the phone companies, and I realized my mistake and had to jump into the deep end of the cyber pool and come up to speed on the Unix operating system. And in doing that, discovered that Dark Dante had pretty much figured out how to compromise the entire phone system of America. I actually found a digital photo that he'd put on his hard drive, a picture of him with his grandpa's pick set, picking the 30-year-old rusty lock of the central office of the phone company. He would exploit that physical vulnerability to gain access, to gather up passwords, manuals, equipment. He'd take it home to his apartment, study it the wee hours of the morning, and then advance a far more sophisticated cyber attack than he ever could have done but for the physical vulnerability. And the flip side of that coin was also emerging at that time. In the task force, we saw that the SCADA systems that controlled critical systems in Los Angeles had cyber vulnerabilities, which once exploited would undermine the physical world interests. Not unlike our Iranian friends learned many years later with the Stuxnet. So that was suggesting a new model in my mind, one that would actually reflect the future we're going to, especially with the Internet of Everything, where physical vulnerabilities would undermine cyber interests, cyber vulnerabilities would undermine physical interests, and champion the notion that in order to optimally do battle in that converging world, the best way to structure a security program was to bring physical and cyber security in under one umbrella. And I started championing that model. Still very much in the reactive mindset, but was one that would optimally position us to do battle. I actually had a chance to validate that model further, where shortly after doing battle with Dark Dante, the FBI inserted me in undercover at the CIA. It was in the wake of the Aldrich Ames espionage case. The FBI and the CIA had taken black eyes, if you will, because they hadn't played together as well as they should have. And the feeling was that if they played better together, they could have caught Ames much more quickly. As a result of that, President Clinton signed an executive order that inserted 2 of us into the CIA in the new Counterespionage Group, and were charged specifically with finding what we knew was another mole. We had a short list and started working that list, and were fortunate enough actually to come up with one name, James Harold Nicholson, who we followed to Singapore, where he claimed he was going to be on vacation. We actually watched him for 3 days as he walked around town looking at reflections in the pane glass windows of department stores. That's an action we know as dry cleaning. He wasn't looking at what was behind the glass. He was, of course, looking and trying to detect any surveillance that was perhaps following him there in Singapore while he's on vacation. On the 3rd day, a black limo pulled up to the curb, the door opened up, and James hopped in. We looked down at the license plate. It was a Russian embassy. We had caught or identified our spy. But knowing who the spy was different than actually being able to build the legal case against him. We then assigned him back at CIA headquarters to sit in the Counterterrorism Center. At the time, that was where it seemed he could do the least damage. It was pre-9/11, and of course things change over time. But it was amazing as I watched him immediately start to assess the relative strengths of the physical world and the cyber world there at the CIA. Both of them were very strong. Movies were made about the strength of their physical security, and in the cybersecurity space, the CIA was one of the first to deploy and use digital rights management. But Jim reviewed both of those worlds and ultimately decided that he had a better chance of doing what he needed to do by exploiting a weakness in the physical world. He would take a picture with an old-fashioned camera of the document the Russians wanted, not knowing that I had installed a pinhole cyber camera, a fiber optic camera above him in the ceiling, and so I was taking pictures as he was taking pictures, but then watching him put the film in his pocket and walk it out past the guards. We eventually manipulated him into taking a trip and leaving his car at the CIA compound. We were able to enter the car. We were going to establish or install a GPS device. In those days, they were huge boxes, and we had to have a special bracket in order to hold it in one of the rear panels of his cars. It seemed like a prudent thing to do because of the risk we would run in doing 24/7 surveillance of him, that there was a chance that he was going to detect that eventually. So in one of the first instances of utilizing what was emerging as this new technology, we installed this cumbersome GPS device in his vehicle. We also found his laptop at that time and did a quick image of it and actually detected on that laptop a tasking order from his Russian handler, which was really the evidence that we needed to finally close the case and arrest him on the tarmac of Dulles International Airport shortly thereafter. But again, further validation of the interplay between the physical and the cyber worlds. In fact, in those days that I was working that case out at CIA, the FBI would pull me back to headquarters on Mondays. It was like they were afraid I'd go native or something if they left me out there too long. But on those Monday meetings, a friend of mine who was on loan to the State Department as a liaison officer, I remember he came up to me. His name was Bob. He was famous for treating people with a lot of condescension and arrogance even. He didn't treat me with that because he knew I had caught Dark Dante, and I'd never shared with him that eunuch story, or perhaps he would have dished out my fair share of his disdain. But I remember Bob coming up to me one Monday and asking me, he says, "John, what do you think if a foreign intelligence service had the discipline to restrict all their activities, the initial targeting and assessment of an individual, their recruitment, their handling, their compensation, and their retirement, all in cyberspace, would we have the skills and abilities to detect them?" And I said, "Bob, you know, as much as we've made progress since the days I chased Dark Dante, I'd have to say there stands a good chance that they might get away with it." Imagine my surprise when a few months later I opened the Washington Post, and there on the cover of the Washington Post was the picture of Bob Hansen, the highest-ranking FBI agent ever arrested for espionage. And where did we catch him? Not in cyberspace, where I told him he'd be relatively safe, but out servicing what we call a dead drop in the physical world. Again, another interplay and dynamic reflecting the way in which the physical and cyber worlds come together. He had to play with who had brought him to the game of espionage, and at that time, the tactics and techniques of the Russians involved still very much activities and movement within the physical space. So it was not too long after the experience at the CIA, I helped the FBI subsequently stand up their cyber center. I did some work with the national labs and at the Department of Energy, but eventually got word that Bell Labs, Lucent, had heard of the model that I had been championing of bringing physical and logical together under one umbrella, and asked me if I wouldn't join them in the private sector. At the time, I had actually progressed so quickly up through the ranks of the FBI that they were telling me that I had come too quickly. I was too young for the next step. I told them, "Look, I'm your attorney. You can't say it that way. You have to say your knowledge, skills, and abilities aren't right. You can't say anything about age." But I said, "But it really doesn't matter because I'm going to go and join Bell Labs to see if indeed I can implement this new model." And as I jumped and moved into the private sector, it was the first time that it occurred to me that it would be very prudent, given the abysmal performance levels of our traditional anti antivirus partners to start managing the expectations of my new leadership team. Because clearly I understood that it was not going to be if, but when we were going to be compromised. In fact, I started championing with some of my other peers in the industry that mantra, not if, but when. Not if, but when. If we were in the room together, I'd ask you to raise your hands and see how many of you are familiar with that mantra. It was galling professionally to have to admit that, but it seemed like to do otherwise meant that should we get compromised, I would be immediately summarily fired instead of turning the discussion to more important things. So I managed that expectation. And in fact, in each of the private companies, I was eventually to serve as CSO, both at Lucent, Dell Labs, Honeywell, and at Dell eventually. I would experience a compromise that validated that, in fact, that it is not if, but when. Most of us are going to experience that compromise. But at Honeywell, it was important that I had done that because shortly after getting there, there were a rash of APT attacks, particularly in Texas among the oil companies. At Honeywell, we were about to go into negotiations with the Chinese on building a new platform, an avionics platform that would go up against Boeing and Airbus. I was scratching my head because I was thinking, if anyone should be on the victim list, it should be us. But I looked at our logs. I couldn't see it. It was an interpretation challenge. I couldn't see anything insidious on the logs. It all looked like benign activities until one day I got a call from my buddies back at the FBI and said, John, we've been monitoring a known Chinese bot master, and one of your machines is emanating out to him. I said, there you have it. I was right. We are on the victim list. Then I had, of course, to make that long walk up to the third floor where the C-suite, to the CEO's office, and remind him, remember when I said it was not if, but when? Well, it's when. And to their credit, because normally the reaction is when you discovered a compromise, you want to just bring it down right away, stop the bleeding. To their credit, they gave me 3 months within which to detect and discern where are the back doors, how badly had they compromised. Those 3 months were the longest 3 years of my life. Very humbling as well, because during that time, not only did they demonstrate that they had the prowess to get in, and I say prowess, it was really just spear phishing again, not too sophisticated actually, but then once they got in, they actually ran for those privileged accounts and went as wide and as far as they could and as deep as they could. And then, and this was what was really scary, they sat silent for over 2 years until the negotiations were about to start, and then they launched and exercised the prowess that their compromise gave them. Of course, when we finally thought we had discerned where all the back doors were and had them contained, it was then a question of when were we going to bring this down. There were those who were championing, suggesting that I actually engage the government and let us demarche the Chinese. I had seen the Brits do that just a few months earlier, and all they got for their efforts were protestations on the part of the Chinese that it was, no, not us. You have a dark Dante, we have a dark Dante. And I just wasn't in the mood to hear that. And then I realized that we were coming up on Chinese New Year. I said, that's it. We'll bring it down in the whole thing down in the middle of Chinese New Year. Because if it is their version of Dark Dante, when I was chasing Dark Dante, the kid never slept. He was always looking over his shoulder, looking to see if I was about to swoop in. He was also trying to figure out how he was going to live. It's hard to make a living when the FBI is after you. He'd actually figured out that he could seize the phone lines of the radio station in Los Angeles that was giving away a Porsche to the 107th caller. He had the power to seize those phone lines and was every caller after, I think, about the 100th caller, and that summer won 2 Porsches. He promptly sold those Porsches for cash so he could live on that, which in America constitutes money laundering. He actually did more jail time for money laundering than he did the cyber things that I ultimately got him convicted on. But I knew that if indeed these were a Chinese version of Dark Dante and we brought it down in the middle of Chinese New Year, the response would be immediate. But if, on the other hand, it were government employees, people who value the most important holiday in the Chinese calendar, it's very likely that they could be on vacation and wouldn't respond until that next Monday. So we brought it down. Absolute silence. Not a cyber whimper out of them till that next Monday. And then all hell broke loose. They were looking, scrambling for their back doors and were finding them closed. Now, not that this group needed yet another anecdote to tell or suggest that what we're faced in today's world, unfortunately still very much in the reactive mode, is no less than the full strength and prowess of a nation state. It explains and helps us understand why, particularly since so often The compromise was a result of malware that our AV partners failed to catch, that we had to adopt these intense and complicated defense in-depth structures. They were complex, they were costly, they were reactive, post-execution. Clearly, with all this in mind, we knew and that the time was for a new paradigm. During the time of George Washington in the American Revolution, they actually questioned him once and asked George, well, George, what keeps you up most at night? And his response wasn't that it wasn't the Continental Congress that even then seemed challenged when it came to doing anything productive. It wasn't his troops starving and freezing to death out in Valley Forge. George's answer was their spies, the trusted insiders. And from that time, for over 240 years in America at least, we've been amassing an understanding. We've been gaining insights into those early indications of a trusted insider who is thinking or who perhaps already has turned towards the dark side and had those indications in hand, but we're still nonetheless unable to actually wrap our arms around that. Of course, the Snowden affair caused the insider and the focus that we give that to come to a pinnacle or a breaking point. The U.S. government finally came out with its requirement that if indeed you wanted to do business with them going forward, you had to have in place by the end of last year what they called a viable or trusted insider program. Now, no one's really quite sure just what they mean by viable, but I'm absolutely convinced that it's going to have to be the demonstrated use of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the battle that we advance. It's going to involve big data analytics. In fact, big data analytics in this context of the trusted insider was the first glimpse I had as a professional of just what AI and machine learning might ultimately mean for us. We knew we had to do better, and that was going to be a path by which to do it. As I reflected on this reactive detection versus prevention that we tried to advance in terms of the trusted insider, it occurred to me that the reason why we had failed so abysmally is because it was a big data problem. All those early indicators were too numerous and distributed across too many repositories to wrap our cognitively limited minds around them. But of course, fortunately, the times are changing. Technologies were evolving. Software was developed. In fact, Michael Dell went out and bought 2 pieces of software, Statistica and another, that enabled us to look at both structured and unstructured data. The other one was Katanga, and we were able to leverage those, pulling those together to look across many different repositories in which those early indicators resided, and to pull that into a single algorithm that indeed allowed us to predict or to demonstrate that we could wrap our arms around this perennial problem of the trusted insider. We did that at Dell. And in fact, we ran a pilot in the federal enclave. In fact, we tweaked the identity of the director of the program so that if the algorithm worked, it would kick his name out as that individual about whom we should be most concerned. A few weeks into the pilot, the team came walking towards my cube. We don't have offices at Dell. And I could see on their faces they were disturbed about something. I asked them, what's up? Is there something wrong with the pilot? In response, they said, no, the pilot seems to be going well, but according to the algorithm, the person about whom we should be most concerned is our boss. I said, yes. And they looked at me rather strange. They said, that's not the reaction we thought you would have. I said, well, let me explain. And I told them how we had tweaked the identity. It also at that time occurred to me that while the employees that we have in the federal business who deal with the government had for the most part clearances and had signed on for that kind of scrutiny, there are a lot of our employees who had never agreed to such scrutiny, and were individuals who, if we had labeled them with a propensity towards some evil act, as this algorithm now allowed us to do, just being tagged with that label of having a propensity towards evil could prejudicially impact their careers. So this was an instance where technology was getting out ahead of us in terms of our ethical understanding and our appreciation of the controls and things we needed to put in place. So we had to backtrack a little bit and make sure that we used anonymization to keep their identities unknown until they passed a critical threshold, and only at that point then would we engage. But with that solution in hand, we had positioned Dell so that it could continue to do business in a critical area of the market, the federal government. As such, security suddenly found itself no longer as a distasteful cost of doing business, but now an indispensable and in a way, an inextricable aspect of advancing it. Inextricable because there was the regulation that you had to have the insider threat program. Indispensable because we ultimately produced a solution at a price point that would make us competitive in the marketplace. So we were both indispensable and inextricable. We become no longer just the guns, gates, guards, and geeks of yesterday, but had now become a function or an activity that was now owned and appreciated by all. And when I say all, I actually mean every single individual user, what I call the wetware. You know, we all have these shoulders, and on these shoulders we have this orb, and inside that orb, where that is an organ that's 76% water. Over the years, I've gradually done battle with hardware and software and the challenges and the risks associated with that, but there's one area, the wetware, that continues to plague me and is a challenge notwithstanding all the training and efforts that I've thrown at the wetware. We know that in the area of cyber warfare that the nation state will ultimately be the target, but it'll still be the individual that they try and target first in advancing any act of cyber warfare. And as we saw at Honeywell, we'll probably use spear phishing draped in what I call beguiling specificity. This is information that, again, our employees or we ourselves unthinkingly post out there on social media that is then easily harvested by an adversary and used in getting us to click. I'm thinking of the poor man who instead of going to his daughter's soccer game, she's a cute little button, but she can't play soccer at all, and she's never scored, and he has a project due the next Monday, so he tells his wife, you go ahead and take her, I'm going to stay and work on my project. A couple hours later, they return and the house erupts into chaos. Wouldn't you know it, that little button scored. Not only did she scored the winning goal. And our man, he missed that singular opportunity in his daughter's life. Of course, his wife immediately posts that achievement out on social media, and he goes the next morning to the office, and as he turns in his project, he goes back to his desk, and the first thing he sees is an unsolicited email from someone saying, here's a picture of your daughter kicking the winning goal at last Saturday's soccer game. I mean, what guilt-ridden father isn't going to click? And that's why, again, another instance of why it's always a case of not if, but when. Adversaries know us as human beings. They know the weaknesses, the guilts, the ways in which they can exploit our weaknesses in getting us to click. Of course, the impact and the significance of that, and then the reasons why we really do need an all hands on decks, is chronicled by the fact that if we were to take the global cost of cybercrime, an estimated $500 billion, and translate that into what we could call hacker revenue, it would actually constitute the world's largest company. Director Comey recently observed that the internet is where the bad guys are going to go because it's where our lives are today, our money, our secrets, our intellectual property. That's why the Willie Suttons of today, and you may know that Willie Sutton was a notorious bank robber back in the early 1900s, who when he was leaving a courthouse was approached by a member of the press and asked, Willie, why do you rob banks? Of course, Willie's response, that's where the money is. And in fact, the fact that the revenue is out there and that's where the money is chronicled by this chart that shows the values and the revenue now being garnered on the darknet for stolen credentials, credit card information. Note particularly healthcare insurance credentials. I was amazed, $2,000 for a single credential. Of course, it occurred to me that ostensibly that's what enables you to actually access some very expensive drugs, and that might be indeed why it can command such a high price. The other facts that we have to face today is that this internet security has indeed become a global issue. During the time we will have spent together this morning, more than 1.5 million people during this hour will have become compromised. 18 people per second, costing the world more than the combined global markets in marijuana, cocaine, and heroin combined. We also need to go no further than actually the headlines of recent years to see, again, the way in which these issues are impacting our communities. Starting back particularly in 2013 with the Target compromise. That's always near and dear to my heart because it was one of the first in which not only the CSO got fired, but the CEO and the CIO as well, confirming once again that we're only as strong as our weakest connected link. You'll recall in that instance it was the HVAC partner who actually was compromised, and it was through that conduit that the bad guys ultimately got into what they were seeking and targeting. And of course, in 2016, the headlines only continue almost daily we see yet again something that's going on. This last year, the 3,000 data breaches, 22 billion records stolen, $81 billion stolen from Bangladesh, the NSA's continuing challenges, Yahoo's 500 million accounts, and the fact that Verizon actually lowered their bid by a tune of $1 billion. That really brings it home as something that everybody has to pay attention to. And of course, in these recent weeks, the latest WikiLeaks that have come out. The other significance of this is further punctuated by the cost that was ultimately assigned to the remediation efforts of fixing the Target 2014 compromise, $148 million. The situation is further characterized by the fact that we're now being told that over 100,000 new malware samples are being discovered every day. And that's significant because of this next fact, the fact that at any moment, at their best, usually around 19%, but sometimes a lot worse, our malware partners are only able to capture that percentage of these new malware viruses. So it helps understand that, again, that's why we were right to say it's not if but when, so that when these partners fail us and we do incur the compromise like I did at Honeywell, instead of summarily firing me, we can turn our discussion to something more productive, like how well had we identified our critical assets? How well did we enclave the underlying IT structure that support those assets? How quickly did we detect? In the reactive world, it was still time to detection that was so critical. How well did we contain it? How efficiently did we expel it? And did we leverage the new insights gained in raising the bar so that the next time they tried to compromise us or did compromise us, it was something they were going to have to spend much more time, money, energy, and resources in doing? And again, that's all exacerbated by the fact that, again, we're only catching 19% of those efforts. So it's, again, in that effort of not if but when that we had to devise these defense in depth structures. The idea or hope being that when the upper level of antivirus failed us, that the lower levels would indeed stop the attack, whether it was the detection, the incident response, triage, damage mitigation, remediation, all very intense resource and cost and time constrained. And again, something from which the security industry has long profited very nicely. They've garnered some nice profits over the years because of the need for this defense in depth, because our traditional antivirus partner has classically failed us. And when we remember, as the Verizon report told us, that 90% of all breaches are still tied back in some way to malware, it becomes a consequential issue for us. In fact, it precipitates what Thomas Kuhn, the American physicist and historian and philosopher of science, observed over 50 years ago in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. He said there will arrive periods of normal science that are interrupted by revolutionary science, new paradigms to change the game, the standards and the best practices that we've traditionally used and advanced. And indeed, we've reached a point where that new paradigm has arisen. It's been expressed in terms of the frustration that is felt by many. We felt it at Dell, where our CTO basically declared that he was not going to tolerate any longer what he called sacrificial lambs. No more sacrificing at least one endpoint of an employee's computer for the greater good, so we could create that vaccine, if you will. We always had to offer one machine up so we could get that signature. No more sacrificial lambs. And what he did actually is he went out and surveyed the entire global community and established that there were 60 companies at that time who were claiming to advance what they called advanced endpoint protection. Against those 60 companies, he had our company Secureworks that Michael had recently bought. He had and asked them to bundle together a collection of evil, unlike anything except perhaps what the Center for Disease Control has in the physical world down in Atlanta. He asked them to bundle a collection of over 4,100 viruses, 460 of which were 0 days, never having seen the light of day, to bundle those together so that he could run that package of 4,100 against each of these 60 solutions. And out of those 60, one small, little-known startup, because the U.S. Congress had not issued its report on the OPM breach yet, but one little-known company actually produced an efficacy rate of 99.7%. Incredible. Our CTO, his name is Chad Skipper, he was excited by this. he actually got Michael Dell excited. Michael tried to buy the solution. It wouldn't sell, and so he ended up doing the next best thing and established an OEM agreement, an exclusive agreement with Cylance, in which they now embed that in the solutions they now sell to enterprises. I heard about this, was a little concerned about it because I had promised Michael Dell that I would always deploy internally whatever we were offering externally to our customers. And at this time that this was going on, I was actually doing battle with an APT event. I had once again, because my AV partner had failed me, been compromised. I had quickly detected, I had contained, I'd expelled, I had leveraged the experience and had gained some new insights, and around those insights had planned out some courses of actions that I was eager to take, that I had funded, I had resources for, I was busy and wanted to advance those forward. I didn't need a distraction like this. Besides, I knew it had to be wrong. Something was wrong. There's no way, given the fact that I'd lived with rates of 19% for 20 plus years in my professional career, that this could possibly be right. I grabbed my team and said, take this in the back room, test it with what the Chinese just threw at us, and when it fails, come back and tell me so I can tell Michael and the others to stand down while we continue to advance what we've got on our plate already. The team came back a couple days later, and I was surprised because these were the ops guys. They're the curmudgeons. They never smile. And as they were coming towards me, I saw they had on their face what we call smiles. I said, wow, this can't be good. And as they walked up, they said, we don't know what to tell you, boss. If we'd had Cylance in place, we would not have lost Christmas. All those late night hours that we've been spending, all these elaborate defense in depth structures that we're continuing to build out would not be necessary because of this efficacy rate. And in the quiet of my study, the implications of a success rate at that level started to distill upon my senses. The downstream costs and energy and effort would not have to be what it was in the past. I could actually divert and liberate some of those resources and energies over to things like the trusted insider piece. It was then that I reached out to the CEO of Cylance, and I actually was going to put him in a headlock so I could get friends and family pricing out of him, but told him that I was his, that I hadn't in all my professional career seen anything with this kind of power and strength. I actually had to go to Michael Dell and explain to him that I wasn't really leaving him. I said, Michael, think of it this way. They're an OEM partner of yours. Yeah, just think of me as moving up your kill chain. Up that rung of the ladder where delivery is so critical, and actually applying our efforts there in a way that is effective at the rate of 99.7%. And of course it begs the question, well, just how can it do that? How does this actually work? How does AI and machine learning actually enable us to achieve that kind of efficacy? And what we did basically as science is put mathematicians in a room for over 2.5 years while they surveyed the files that make up the internet. And based purely on the information contained in the file, we're able to extract what the qualities and attributes were, millions of attributes. We're able to quantify, turn that into an integer that they then poured into a math model, and that ultimately resides in an algorithm that sits on the endpoint with very little space, just 20, 30 megs, and utilizes very little CPU, but was able to garner basically, to create what we call the genomic structure of the internet, and identify these patterns as the files of the internet have gradually evolved, that there are patterns in there that we could identify and apply a mathematical number to. And in a way that human beings simply are incapable of doing, particularly since a lot of those viruses today are being packed or morphed at a rate that the human being and the processes associated with classic signature-based approaches just can't keep up with. So it's the prediction based on these learned qualities of earlier data that we have experience with that enables us with artificial intelligence and machine learning to differentiate the malicious files from the safe ones at this amazing 99.7% effective rate. It was because of that power that I then told Michael that I was leaving, and I've been now here at Cylance for the last 9 months. But again, AI's machine learning it's a type of artificial intelligence that enables us, the computer, to the ability to learn without being expressly programmed, without that intervention or that slowing process that human beings introduce into the process. And of course, AI provides us this opportunity pre-execution, and that's critical, where it prevents the malware before it has a chance to unload and to cause the disruption that we've seen. And again, I see from a technology perspective this being one of the most disruptive things that I've seen in the last 2 decades. But, you know, interesting enough, security as an industry is not the first one to the game. We've seen healthcare, insurance, and the high-frequency trading businesses have been applying the principles of AI machine learning for some time to process and analyze enormous quantities of business data and leveraging autonomous decision making. But at the core of AI-based security approach is this ability capable of applying highly tuned algorithmic models to just enormous amounts of data that are coming at us. The AI approach will actually fundamentally change the way we understand and continue to engage not only the challenge posed by malicious code, but other challenges such as passwords, access, and authentication. We really don't want to be thought of as just an antivirus company, but really want to be thought of as an AI company that can wrap our arms around such problems as passwords and access, leveraging the same strength that AI can afford us when it comes to identifying the qualities and attributes of a malicious file, but also turn that same ability towards identifying and recognizing a user as indeed that user. So more to come along those lines. An exciting time to be a part of the business. Really shows that, as Thomas Kuhn predicted, that we're seeing an old paradigm of the reactive now being challenged by the proactively predictive. We truly see security emerging as a science. We have then proactively moved into the realm of being proactively predictive. We map the genomic structure of the internet. We predict and then block cyber attacks before they can execute using the strength of artificial intelligence algorithms. And never was this strength more dramatically demonstrated than when the OPM report came out. Congress did their study after the OPM breach, and in that report basically called out that a little-known startup named Cylance played a pivotal role in stopping and remediating that malware using AI and the fact that we weren't dependent on signatures. In fact, the OPM had been breached much earlier and should have been a warning or a signal to them, but it wasn't again until a year later when they actually brought Cylance in, and with using tools that had a capability that no one else did, we're able to actually detect that compromise. And again, OPM was in the wake of a number of other federal breaches that of course all pale in comparison to the breach that occurred at OPM, wherein because of the lax state that had been warned of since 2005, that again the situation was such that the systems could be exposed to compromise by an experienced hacker or any one of a number of other actors. And in fact, that ultimately happened to the tune of 21.5 million individuals being compromised their information. Not only the holders of security clearances, but in my case, my wife and my sons, they came up and thanked me for the fact that their identities were now, and their personal information was now compromised out there. Ultimately, even the OPM IT security officer, a gentleman by the name of Jeff Wagner, said that it was really because Cylance doesn't utilize the standard signatures or heuristics or indicators or the normal signatures that enabled us to help and detect and to do that which their other partners could not do. In fact, their other partners had actually declared them healthy when we came in and applied Cylance Protect, and the panel, of course, lit up like a Christmas tree, and we were able to identify and expel then those compromises that were there, and then lock the doors, proverbial doors, after we had expelled those individuals. For years, I always said my favorite movie was Groundhog Day with Bill Murray. It's the story of a narcissistic weatherman who's doomed to live the same day over and over again. Well, in security, I felt that's the life I was doomed to, living each day over and over again. Well, I'm happy to say that the groundhog is dead. I impaled him with the cyber lance that Cylance brings to the battlefield with artificial intelligence and machine learning. And in that effort, we'll be battling basically a security paradigm with signature based at the center of the universe that we've been battling for the last 2 decades. But this new approach truly has infused new life into the profession. Artificial intelligence redefines and strengthens our cyber community. And I do believe that machine learning will not lose its strength over time. So often in the technology wars, we see one technology arrives and the bad guys counter. I used to battle the Romanian acrobats as they were attacking our supply chain. They would actually come up behind our loads at night, turn out their lights, come out over the hood and jump through space, attach themselves to the back of the truck, break open the locks, and then toss out the computers. We figured out that we would embed GPS in those boxes, and the next time they stole them, the GPS devices beaconed out to law enforcement, and we were able to swoop down and arrest our adversaries. That didn't work so well in Mexico, where the cartels had enough money that when they found out we were embedding GPS, they used their resources to come up with GPS suppression. The ball was then back over into our court. What did we come up with? Well, we came up with burst transmission. And so there's that constant tension and play when it comes to new technologies between the adversaries and those battling them. And I suspect fully that when it comes to AI, that we should anticipate and expect, because there's just so much money at stake, that they'll try and figure out ways to either counter or circumvent the AI. In fact, we've already seen in China where, as we squeeze the cyber end of the balloon, the physical balloon sort of blossoms out. We've seen them come to employees, trusted employees, and said, look, we want you to go after this information, but we don't want you to use cyber at all. Go in, get the information, walk it back out, one grain of rice at a time, if you will, download the information on a separate computer and send it to us, so that McClurg and his team can't be alerted that we're doing that. So that's, again, the play between the physical and the cyber world that we'll continue to see, and it's already started to manifest itself. But truly, we're seeing the dawn of a new age, a paradigm shift, not unlike that Copernicus and Galileo advanced back when they suggested the sun was the center of the universe. Copernicus had the good sense to die shortly after authoring the model. Galileo, the poor mope, was the guy who really had to suffer most in terms of battling the established paradigm. But we at Cylance somewhat feel like we can relate to Galileo as we try and champion this new model. Already we can see the battlefield being clouded by the established paradigm saying, oh yeah, we do artificial intelligence, we do machine learning as well. And there's going to be a cloud of conflicting dialogue and messages. That's why at the end of the day, we declare that everyone needs to prove it for themselves. Don't take anyone's word for it. I didn't take my own CTO's word for it at Dell. I'm told I exude a certain amount of passion when it comes to this. I say, don't be beguiled by my passion, but actually you can go out to our website, sign up for a proof of concept, and actually with our team we'll help you engage. You got to be careful when you're wielding a bunch of viruses and ransomware and malware on how you run these tests, but we can help you prove for yourself, even utilizing perhaps some of the viruses or malware that was used to compromise you, in proving for yourself that indeed this new age is here and that the prowess of artificial intelligence is there for us to garner. Now, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't observe that of late there have been some very bright individuals, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, Elon Musk, all calling what I call it, putting out their clarion calls of caution. And that's not unlike what we've heard with almost every new technology that comes along. There's always a two-edge to each technology that can be used for good and evil, and AI is no different. So all that speaks to is that we need to be very cautious, thoughtful in how we deploy and engage this new technology. But at the end of the day, I think you'll agree that if I were to approach you again with the phrase, may you live in interesting times, there would be no doubt in any of our minds that what I pronounced was indeed a blessing and not a curse. Thank you very much for your time and attention. Ardian, I'll turn the time back over to you so we can go over the remaining information and any questions that might be out there.
Yes, John. Thank you, John, for delivering this very informative presentation. I just want to inform the audience that PCB provides training and certification services for ISO 27001 introduction, foundation, lead implementer, and lead auditor. The training is designed to provide you with the required knowledge to carry out audits of information security management systems against ISO 27001 and also be able to run the processes involved in implementing ISMS as defined in the standard. A PCB certificate will exemplify your dedication in implementing and managing these processes and frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now, we will go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees regarding today's topic. One attendee asks, is AI able to assist in any modality with the creation of documentation and policy requirements of ISO 27001?
Well, indeed, it's going to have a lot of strengths and abilities when it comes to meeting and responding to these classic audits. I think we all need to appreciate that the auditors, and as we come up with these audits, they themselves were sort of faced with the same frustration that the rest of us were, that you had to have this defense in depth, and that what they'll audit against is the manner and the efficiencies and the effectiveness with which you've deployed and built these elaborate structures. And at Dell, I would get awards every year for having the #1 security organization, in part because of the elaborate and complex way in which I'd weave these intricate systems together that would score very well and nicely on a lot of these audits, but that ultimately, as we deploy something as effective as Cylance at the upper levels of the kill chain, a lot of that downstream structure and need will ultimately be liberated, so we can turn those resources to other activities. Now, that might in the near term cause the auditors to call up short and to query or question us, but usually are open-minded enough that if we can show that we have compensating controls at a higher level of the kill chain, making it less needful that we have some of those historic structures, I think we'll begin to see a gradual change or evolution in the way in which these audits are advanced. Arjun, I hope that was somewhat responsive to the question.
Yeah, John, thank you. Another attendee asks, please advise what the best criminal procedure law followed in USA in case of a cybercrime.
Well, there are lots of laws on the books in terms of how you can engage law enforcement in prosecuting some of these events. It often requires that you bring them in early. A lot of times the companies aren't so much interested in prosecuting as just early detection and stopping it and bringing it down. But again, the challenge in the trial there is to do it almost live, real time, and to engage law enforcement early. And in fact, in the United States, we're actually re-examining some of the models that we've used over the years. I was at FBI headquarters where we first deployed InfraGard, what I call 1.0. We know and appreciate that 20 years later, given the rate and pace at which artificial intelligence and viruses and malware that now morph automatically, that we need to re-examine the model of exchange and engagement when it comes to battling real time and engaging and partnering with law enforcement towards that end.
Thank you, John. Another question is, do you find many auditors are ensconced in the paradigms of the past, or are willing to freely accept the evolution to the new proactive paradigm, which i.e. portends, when auditing for compliance to the requirements of ISO 27001, i.e. do they want to hold you to the old standards that they're used to?
Yeah, and unfortunately, and again, this is what's characteristic. Thomas Kuhn talked about this in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. It's going to take a little time to instill in the auditors and the creators of these standards the comfort level that indeed we've moved through the proactive paradigm of prediction and prevention to a point where what wove its way into the standards in the way of reactive solutions, reactive protocols, are going to be less consequential than they once were. Clearly, even with Cylance, with the 99.7, that says, well, wait a minute, that's still these 0.3% out there. Even if you block, we said 90% of the compromises are tied back to malware. If of that 90% we block 99.7, there's still 0.3% of the 90%, not to mention the other 10% that were never tied to malware, that they're still going to have to be responded to and engaged in some way, including structures that still in many instances are part of what the ISO standards or the NIST standards are looking at. So there will still always be a role to probably maintain some of those. It's just the emphasis and the time, energy, and effort spent on them will be something you can justify as being less than what it historically required because of the way this shift will occur. Although the elements may still be there, the focus and energy and effort put in on them will have to shift to appreciate the success that we're now garnering with the advance of AI and machine learning.
Thank you, John. Now, because of the time limitation, we will only answer one more question, and the rest of the questions will be answered by email by John. The last question is, what are the best practices and procedures to remediate a cyber attack?
Well, it's interesting, Artie, and even the question of best practices, remember what Thomas Kuhn said, that once you shift paradigms, once you shift from the reactive detection to proactive prevention, when you pose the question, what is the best practices? Well, you almost have to say, well, best practices if you want to stay in a reactive world, because then there's certain things that are called out as best practice, or what are best practices if you want to move into the world of proactive prevention? And clearly right now, as is established in the investigation of the U.S. Congress into what happened at OPM, clearly one of the best practices now is in the proactive prevention area is the use and engagement of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the form that pre-execution that Cylance is now offering. I think everybody would agree that best is clearly reflected in that 99.7% effective rate when compared to the abysmal 19% and others that have been out there. Under almost any measure, imagined measure, I would think that that's probably going to garner for it that classification of best. But again, it still depends, and you need to be conscious of that as you pose those questions to make sure the person asking the question, which of the two paradigms are they standing in, and make sure you address it based on which paradigm they're standing in. And in the end of the day, saying then, you know, you really need to think about wrapping your arms around best practices in that superior paradigm of the proactively preventative. Thanks, Ardian.
Thank you, John, again for this great presentation, and thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and posted on our website and as well as on our YouTube channel. Once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey about the presentation, and we would appreciate it if you would complete it and provide us with your feedback. Also, if you're aware of an interesting topic that you would like to discuss and participants would benefit from, please feel free to write down your suggestions. For more information, visit our website www.pcb.com. Thank you all and have a great day.